Okay, so we're now recording. Okay, so social farms and gardens have been doing a bit of work over the last 3 or 4 years, particularly focused on increasing the amount of fruit and veg that's available. We've been doing a lot of this work, particularly in Wales, because there's been kind of capacity to do it over here, but also obviously some of the findings and the impact of that is working across the UK. In early 2022, we started a project called Sustainable Procurement for Local Prosperity, which was a really catchy title, but it was focused on increasing the amount of fruit and veg that was available to the public sector. And since then, lots more projects kind of working on that. And more, one of the things that's coming out of that is that extra kind of cog in the wheel around the supply chain there, which lengthens the supply chain slightly from direct sales that a lot of the small scale and market gardens and community gardens are kind of traditionally doing. But reducing it from those long supply chains that we're currently seeing at the moment that are so fragile. And so the reason that we've kind of got involved in this kind of data capture, I suppose, is that need to be able to demonstrate where you may have a longer supply chain and you haven't got that direct connection in quite the same way with the grower, between the grower and the consumer or the citizen that's eating that food, and building that case around it and that demonstrating the impact of working at small scale, working with the resources on site, reducing your inputs, delivering locally, and bringing in local inputs if there is anything coming in. So that's the kind of reasoning behind why we've been there, is to kind of really get a kind of robust data set around what the actual impact is then, so that can be advocated for and there can be more. It's easier then, I suppose, for public sector to make purchases from local growers and from growers that are using specific techniques that are having a minimal impact on nature and on the carbon impact of their carbon use, incorporating that into their bids and their ability to meet their kind of policy targets. So sorry, that's a bit waffly, but that's kind of where we're at. And we had that pilot was kind of running in 22, 23, and then during 24, some of you may have been aware of a pilot that we've been running in Powys in mid Wales, called the Future Farms programme. And as part of this, we were keen to kind of instill that carbon footprinting approach right from the beginning with the growers that took on the sites there. And we were doing some work with them, but we thought actually we could make this a little bit more impactful. So rather than just working with those 3 growers on the site, we kind of use them as a bit of a test case for expanding the kind of capacity of the Farm Carbon carbon calculator from Farm Carbon Toolkit. That could then be applicable to growers of similar nature across the UK. So that's kind of where this has come from. And I'm going to pass over to Lizzie, who'll be able to give you more in-depth information about this. So I'm going to stop sharing. That's all right, Lizzie?
Yeah, it's going to replace your sharing anyway, Alison, sorry. So yeah, hopefully you can now see these slides. So hi, my name's Lizzy Parker. I work for the Farm Carbon Toolkit and I'm in charge of our Farm Carbon Calculator that Alison's very kindly mentioned already. And it sounds like some people might have already used as well. So we're a community interest company. Like it sounds like lots of the growing spaces that we've got represented today are as well, which is always nice to meet other community interest companies. We were set up about 15 years ago by a group of farmers who wanted to measure their own impact, and then to share what they were finding about carbon footprinting and how they fitted into this world of sustainability tracking with other farmers. So we're now an employee-owned company as well. So really, we're here not for profit. We're here to do a good job and to make sure that actually farmers and growers have what they need to be able to kind of join the conversation on a level playing field. So we have a team of farm and growing advisors who work across the country, particularly advising on soil management, nutrient management, water management. We help provide carbon footprints and roadmaps towards net zero and beyond for everyone from very small scale growers, market gardens, all the way up through to field horticulture and large estates, and actually increasingly work on those kind of landscape scale projects and bringing people together in those landscape scale projects. And we can also offer soil sampling. Is a lot of what we do. So we own and run the Farm Carbon Calculator, which is one of the first tools in the UK that could footprint a farm. So carbon footprinting wasn't set up with farms or growing spaces in mind, unfortunately. And the carbon accounting kind of rules and guidance for doing a carbon footprint for a business that involves land have really evolved a long way in those past 15 years. So what we spend most of our time doing is trying to take those kind of international guidelines, the rules that apply to big corporations, and make sure that smaller organizations, land-based organizations, can play by the rules, which they need to, but on a way that works practically for their business, because otherwise, frankly, if you just were looking at those kind of IPCC guidelines or the GHG protocol, you would probably put them down and move on because there are better things to do in life. So the idea of the Farm Carbon Calculator is that it will always be there free for growers and farmers to do their own carbon footprint, but you can also commission an advisor to do this for you if you do not want to get involved in that process. We would advocate for you to do your own DIY footprint because it really helps you get a sense of lots of things about your business or your enterprise, and it also helps you improve your own carbon literacy. But I'm not going to lie, while the software is free, this does take time. So there is a time commitment there, and it is worth getting organized with it as well. And I'll talk you through some tips in a minute as well about how to go about this. As Alison mentioned, we had some funding from Social Farms and Gardens and worked with Landshare and a number of market gardeners in our network and Alison's network to make sure that we could co-opt what we already had as a farm carbon calculator that works really well at large scale. And when I say large scale, I'm talking hectares rather than acres, and make sure that actually this could be applied when we're talking about meters squared and acres rather than hectares. And we've got a part way towards that, and we don't want to say that this is perfect yet. And it was really nice to hear that some people have used it, because it'd be nice to get your feedback about what we can improve even further. But it is now possible to get onto the tool and to footprint a market garden fairly straightforwardly. So my slide's going to click on. Here we go. Why would we want to do a carbon footprint in the first place? Well, there's lots of reasons. For some people, it's very personally motivated, and they feel committed to the environment and knowing how their business is impacting it. But there's lots of other actually quite practical reasons why you might need to do this. And increasingly, as Alison alluded to, it's something that's being asked for. It allows you to enter different markets than you might have otherwise, and to kind of join into supply chains that might be requiring this, whether that's through public procurement or retail. It also can be really important from a social perspective in terms of communicating your kind of social license to access and grow on land. So we see lots of the farms that we work with bringing their carbon footprint into kind of signage around the farm to help their community understand what they're doing and what's going on, bring people onto the farm and understand what's going on. And it also can be a really good way to evidence the impact of any changes you implement. So, for example, if you take on a new site, it can be a good way to evidence that what you're doing has made a positive change. It can be a really good way to track how changes in your business, for example, if you grow and increase your scale, or equally shift how you're producing what you grow. You can use this as a kind of marker of how that's impacting your business's resilience. So we talk about it like a lens on your business. Instead of a financial lens or a social lens, you might choose to use a carbon lens. It can be really useful for things like funding applications, capital investment loans, and increasingly we're seeing it being used or required even through planning applications. So there'll be quite specific reasons you might need one, but it's kind of nice if when you need it you're a bit more familiar with it. So that's what we're here for, so that it doesn't feel like a complete unknown, let's say. When we talk about a carbon footprint of a farm, the first thing we have to focus on is the emissions. So there's lots of things from a growing enterprise that can result in emissions. So everything we purchase has some embedded, what we'd call embedded carbon emissions, but effectively embedded greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what's gone into the production of those things you're buying. So everything from growing materials, seed, all the way through to wood, any roads that you put in, anything like this will have an embedded emission. But then on your own land, everything that you do to the soil has the potential to release emissions because of the bacteria and microbes that are interacting in the soil. If you apply synthetic fertilizers, they come with a high embedded emission, and they release emissions of nitrous oxide when we apply them to the soil. What we also have as people who manage land is the potential to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's done through long-term drawdown through photosynthesis. Once it's stored in the soil or woody biomass, then we can consider it a carbon removal. The annual turnover is not considered a carbon removal because it's cycling quite quickly, but where we're putting carbon down into woody biomass or soils, deeper into soils, that's considered a removal. And you can see we've kind of got this emission going up and this removal going down. And that's when people talk about net zero, that's what they're talking about, the sizes of those two arrows being balanced. So if your sequestration is equal to your emissions, that's net zero. Fantastic. But for the majority of growing enterprises, actually we'll be producing emissions, and that's okay. We're also producing food, which is something really important that everybody needs to consume. If we can do anything to reduce the emissions associated with producing that food, then great. And if we can do anything to improve the amount of carbon that's being sequestered permanently into soils or woody biomass, then that's even better. So, as I said, the process of doing a carbon footprint can be a bit intimidating. I'm sure some of you will have already found this. This is a complex undertaking, but there's some simple rules to follow that can make it all a lot easier. So what we'd say is spend most of your time gathering your data. So do a little bit of research, see what you need first, and you can do that through the tool, and we can talk about it today. You can get in touch with us for any help. But then spend most of your time, give yourself some opportunity to find that data that you need, because it might not be data you've ever been asked for before. It'll completely depend on your situation. So for example, larger farms that we speak to have to have some of this information for other compliance requirements. You might have some compliance requirements that you need to have it for. So you might have some of it already, but other bits might be less easy to find and might require you to sit down and actually work through it, or ask someone else within your organization. And then getting that data from your head or your invoices or wherever it's coming from into the tool also does take a little bit of time. Some people, when they get used to this, can do this within half an hour. For other people, it's going to take a bit longer. And you don't need to do it all at once. So it's absolutely fine to put it down and come back to it. And I really recommend doing that, because otherwise it will drive you crazy. So then once you've got that carbon footprint, actually working out what to do with it can be the next challenge. So what we try to do in the Farm Carbon Calculator is give you the opportunity to make scenarios. So you can take your footprint and say, what if I change this, this, and this, and I'll show you how to do it in a minute. And that can then really help with forward planning, action planning, and it's where things like those funding and planning applications, the tool can be really useful for those, because you can do it all in the same place. We have a guide. This was there's a specific Market Gardens guide to using the tool that I will share for Alison to circulate, but it's on the tool as well. There's an offline spreadsheet if you prefer to just look at this in a spreadsheet. I mean, that's how some people's brains work, and that's fine. There's a version that you can use for that. But then the easiest thing is actually just to go online and have a go. And you'll see along the bottom that we split the tool into these different sections. There used to be 10, which was a nice round number, but I think there's now 11, which is a bit more frustrating. But for any growing operation, it's going to be these crops, inputs, waste, materials, and fuels. That is where you should spend the time. If you don't even get to distribution or processing, please don't worry about it. And then what you're going to get out is a report. And this report is online, but you can also download it. You can keep that, copy it, share it with a friend, come back to it next year, have another go, edit it. The process gets a lot easier once you've made one report because you've got something to build from. You can download a spreadsheet of your data. So not just that what is calculated, but all the data you entered. So all that time you spend essentially digitizing your information is not wasted, even if you never use that carbon footprint, because you can download this and use it for other purposes. So if you ever need to tell someone all of the fertilizer that you ever purchased, or a summary of your yields from all your crops, you'll have it here ready. And equally, if you've got anybody really techie in your organization, or you have another software come along that you start to use that needs this information, you can get it in this this kind of, it's like a computer readable version of the data. So basically, even if you don't want your carbon footprint out of this, when you finished it, you think, oh, actually, I didn't need it for what I thought I would, you'll still have the digitized data, and that's really useful to then be able to pass between different softwares or different uses that you might have for it. It's free to register. You go to the site and you register here. I'll pop the link to the site in the chat if anyone wants to kind of have a go as we're speaking. But in the meantime, I will just, I'll just try and share a quick live demo with you. Let's hope this works. So when you come to the tool, you will be able to register and log in. And you can literally just start the calculator. If you want to read more, if you want to check the methodology, if you needed help or guide, there are lots of resources here. There's a quick start guide. It'll take you through everything. If you don't remember anything I say, or you don't feel confident, you can come and check. And importantly, the whole methodology of the tool is transparent. So you can go and find out where we got all the information from. And that's really important if you pass this on to, for example, one of your customers, or if you ever need this for like a planning application or anything like that, you can send them this same methodology, all the references, everything like that. Every time we change things, this gets updated, so it will always be there for you. When you log in, you might not have as many reports as me in this demo account. You might just have one or two, but you'll see there's a few useful things you can do. So once you've got more than one report, you can compare them. So if, for example, you had other kind of growers that you are in a group with, you can kind of work together and kind of compare notes, see what you can learn from each other. And similarly, you can copy these reports with this button here. So once you've done 1 year's report, the next year's becomes a lot easier because you can copy and edit it rather than having to start from scratch. So once you start creating a report, you'll see there's this add new report button here. So it makes it nice and simple for you. There's lots of guidance throughout the tool. I've added already some details about my plot. You can add as little or as much as you like. There's only a few pieces that are required. So, fine to get started and just have a go. We try to carbon footprint across the past year. So pick a date that works for you or your business. We try to encourage people to stick to a calendar year or the same as your financial year, because sometimes that makes collecting your data a little bit easier. And then you want to include everything you did within that 12 months. There's some questions here that you can skim through, but importantly, if you are just wanting to do a footprint for the food that you produce as it leaves your, we'll say farm, but as it leaves your land, then you would choose farm gate. But if, for example, you are running a veg box scheme, you might want to include onward distribution or even point of sale, because you're going to be including that extra step in the process. And the things that produce emissions that are associated with that would be the transport from the growing site to where someone buys it, or indeed some of the packaging potentially as well. We then need to enter this section of the calculator. So we're going to say we're a market garden. It's going to ask you in hectares about the area of your site. Now, you don't need to enter this in hectares. You can enter it in acres instead, as a market garden. So I'm going to pop in here that we have one, let's say we have 1 acre. What does non-cropping mean? So non-cropping means areas that you have that are part of your growing site, but that aren't being used for cultivation. So this might be yards, it might be roads, if you have bodies of water, or if you have areas of woodland that are part of your growing site, you would include them here. You don't have to put your postcode in. We're not super worried. It's only if it's useful for you. And then you can move on. So it's really, really minimal what you actually have to enter. There's lots of options there, but don't get hung up or stuck on those. You'll then come to this main part of the calculator, and this is where we start entering our data. So the first place I'd send you would be to crops. You will have a range of crops, and this is actually where it can sometimes get quite hard for the first time you do it. If you're not regularly recording exact quantities of yield, this can be tricky, particularly so if you're like a social community garden who you're not necessarily charging for the food that you produce, or that's not the main focus of what you do. This bit can be tricky, but it can be a good habit to get into to start quantifying that yield. So we have a whole section here which has been added and developed just to make sure that we can capture the information from market gardens for you, and that you can estimate those emissions. Now, in this section, when we capture information about crop, what we're actually doing is 2 things. We're getting information about how much we've produced so that we can say how many emissions we've produced per amount of produce, but also the residues, so the bit that's left behind when you harvest the plant, adds nitrogen back to the soil, and that results in emissions of nitrous oxide. So even though we want to keep that plant matter in the ground and we want to return it to the soil, it does technically produce emissions, and that's something that has to be reported as part of a carbon footprint. So here I'm going to say we leave most of the bean and pea residue in the field. It might be that you remove it for composting, and that's fine. There's options there for that. I'm going to say, now this is where I don't know what a good yield is for. So let's say this is French beans. But for argument's sake, I'm going to say 100 kilos for, what am I going to say? So this is in meters squared for market gardens, because when we talk to people, that was the kind of easiest one to work on. So I'm going to say 40 meters squared. These bits that I'm struggling over, the bits that will be easier for you because you'll have your areas. And if you've got a crop rotation plan that you make at the beginning of the year, it can be really nice to have a go at this and then see if it changes from the yields that you expected, for example. you'll see it's instantly calculated the emissions associated with that item. There's lots of other places where we can go and add things. So things like under materials, we might have some we might have some we might have used things on site to help us grow. So we can add all those here. It's going to ask us for example, how much of that thing we used. So maybe we used some enviromesh to shade. It's going to ask us how much, and then that will make a calculation for us of the emissions. So you can see it's quite quick to get a result. And that result those emissions start to add up, and we'll start to get a picture of where those emissions are coming from. You can see that I've not finished. At this point, I can go away and it will auto save for me. So when I come back, I can just do the next few bits. So you don't need to do it all at once. And this is obviously not a complete footprint, but you start to see that once you've added a couple of things, you can start to compare what's contributing the most to your footprint. And if that's as far as you get, sometimes you do get some surprises. So people are always a bit surprised which things add the most to their emissions. I'm going to stop demoing now, because actually that's all you need to get started. There's so much more we could get into, but actually there's whole training programs on this. So we do run training. If there's anything ever that you feel a bit stuck on, you can drop us an email, and I will, if I can find the right window, I will share with you the details of how to get in touch. Here we go. Oh, that seems wrong. No, that's still wrong. There we go. So please do drop us a line if you'd like more help, and obviously I'm here for the rest of the call, and we can dig into some of those things. So yeah.
That's lovely. Thanks so much, Lizzie. That's a really thorough but not too in-depth, hopefully. Not too overwhelming. So it's a time for questions now. We've got one which we could kick off from Sam in the chat so far. So either feel free to pop them in the chat, or to pop your hand up if you can work out how to do that, either via Zoom or physically. And Lucy and I'll keep an eye, and hopefully come to you. So Sam, do you want to say your question out loud, or do you want me to read it?
Sorry, I'm in a noisy environment, so I have to these off and coming back and forth all the time. I just wondered how often the data gets updated on the system when obviously new research out carbon offsetting, and how often that.
We can't hear so well, Sam, but in the chat it says, how often is the methodology updated according to latest research?
Yeah, so we have an annual update cycle. So there's some standard emissions factors that we use from national data sets. They're updated annually, so we update those annually as well. But we have 2 opportunities in the year, because some of those data sets update earlier than others. So every April we release a big update. Every single emissions factor on the system is checked and updated if there's an update available, and then and that's in April. And then in October we have another quick check where we know that new data is available. But there's people working on the tool every working day of the year. I've got a nice team of 5 people that research things for us, and actually, as well as running the tool, we work as consultants for supply chains and larger companies and estates and things, making sure that they can comply with SBTI and other international standards and agreements. So whatever we learn from that work, we also build into the tool. So yeah, if anything major changes, it gets included pretty quick.
Yeah, I think on that as well, the Lizzie referenced it in her presentation, but when we did the work with them, it was great to see the change log. is written. So all the stuff that we'd suggested might be good is all written in there. What's kind of come out of that, and that was kind of with consultation with others as well. And then also a kind of a list of things that would be nice but haven't been achieved yet, but are kind of there in the thinking. So I was quite impressed by that, which is useful for kind of that transparency that you mentioned.
Yeah, sadly, there's no software in the world that can promise to do everything straight away. We're always balancing different needs across the sector. So, but what's been really nice about working with social farms and gardens, for example, is like having opportunities like this to talk to people who might be using it but aren't yet, or to make sure that, you know, what we add in actually works for people. So, yeah.
Jamie, sorry, we have to leave. Yeah, we've got a couple more questions. Les, do you want to say yours out loud?
Thank you. Great presentation. Interesting tool. I've got a community garden being established on a social housing site where I live, and the local authority is spending maybe £50,000 on actually destroying a piece of. But how do you factor in the capital cost of establishing a site? Or do you?
So the process, so it's there's a lot of nuance in carbon footprinting, right? And what you're getting at is like, before you start, you've got to set out what you're trying to footprint. And so the tool is like mostly set up for someone to take a farm or a growing site and do their annual carbon footprinting. But what you can also do is a theoretical footprint of something that isn't there yet. So we have lots of, for example, garden designers who use a version of our tool to take a project and a kind of design brief and assess their design brief carbon footprint. So that is essentially the capital upfront installation of a garden, and then use what they find to try and reduce the kind of change their design to make sure they can reduce the impact. And then they've got the kind of before and after carbon footprint of their design that they can compare to say, look, this version is better for the environment in terms of not emitting so much carbon to install. So you could take the same approach with this. We have a full section under that materials. There's also an inventory section. So by inventory, we mean upfront capital cost. So we've got everything from like installing polytunnels all the way through to aggregates. It uses the ICE database, which is the same one that is used in the construction industry. So you can use the same emissions factors that the construction industry would be using to estimate that upfront carbon cost of installing something new.
And Alison, can I ask a supplementary question as a board member of SFNG? Would it be possible to customize, because it's a farm calculator, could you make a kind of a community garden calculator that's more kind of appropriate to a smaller scale garden or a care garden?
So this, I'm going to answer this, Alison, if this is okay. So this is one of the really challenging things, right? Is that so we did explore this, Alison and I, and it's not cheap to run these these tools. We do provide versions. So for example, the version I was talking about is called Elemental. It's run for the landscape and garden design sector, and it's very much focused on ornamental. However, there's nothing to stop you using it for the construction of a non-ornamental garden. What we felt was that for the annual footprinting of a community garden at the moment, the most affordable way for us to progress was to kind of co-op this, but there's no reason why we couldn't technically do that, and it does work better for people using it when it's more tailored to what they're doing or growing, or their setup.
Good. I feel a grant application coming on.
Yeah, just get me on the call. It's all good.
We've got a couple of questions that kind of relate to sequestration, but possibly potentially to composting. On my screen, I've only got 6 people. One of them is Martin Richards. Martin, you're a composter, aren't you? I haven't got the wrong person.
No, you got the right person. Hello. Hi.
But I wonder whether can we digress into composting? I mean, I know Lizzie will be happy to do that. But just a few questions around sequestration of flowers versus grass, and kind of thinking particularly about leaving product on the residue on the soil, and bringing that in, and the kind of the carbon impact versus the soil health impact. I don't know whether that might be of interest to people. And so Lizzie, Martin, if
I mean, it's really important, and I think so Alison and I ran a composting panel recently, and we sort of went into this as actually the environmental benefits of lots of practices, and composting being one of them, are so much more diverse than just carbon. And carbon footprinting is one way of looking at a business or an activity, but it's not the only way. So I don't want anyone to get disheartened if an activity results in emissions. And that's what I was trying to explain with the crop residues, is actually composting results in emissions, because what are you doing? You're giving microbes energy. And as a result of giving them energy, they do happen to emit greenhouse gases. Now, is that a bad thing on a site? Not really, if it's part of the circularity of your site, but it doesn't mean that you're allowed to not account for them if you're trying to follow a carbon accounting process. So I just want to kind of everyone to not get too upset or too scared off, or to kind of not include it, or ignore it, or feel like we don't want to say don't compost. We want to say please compost, it's great, it's fab for your soil, but it will, on the surface of it, result in emissions.
Yeah, and just to make everyone aware, I work for a company called Agaton. We are working with Carbon Toolkit on some other projects, watch this space, obviously, with trying to get more of an understanding of how composting does affect obviously the soil emissions, and to elaborate a bit more on a microbial activity. I think this is the thing, is that we need to understand it's a bigger picture when it comes to composting. There are all sorts of different variations in compostings which will also have different emissions. You've got vermicomposting, you've got aerobic, you've got anaerobic. There are all sorts of different variations of this, and I would never say that one would be better than another when it comes to carbon systems. The one thing we need to bear in mind, though, is that if you're composting on your own site, there would be external factors of bringing green waste compost onto site has more detrimental effects in respects to carbon footprints than it does making your own, in a considerable amount. So most green waste compost has to go up to 65 to 70 degrees. In the UK, sometimes, especially this time of year, it's very hard to get to those temperatures, so there has to be fossil fuels involved in that. It's something that I know Carbon Toolkit are working with us to try and get more of an understanding. There are obviously loads of different variations in that, but don't be disheartened with sometimes when it comes out on a carbon calculator, the amounts of carbon it produces, because it's a circular system.
And then the other thing, I think I'm just watching the chat and some of the questions, is when you're looking, so all food production produces emissions, is what I want to say. And you might be doing, for example, using compost instead of doing something that at a large scale might include ploughing, it might include adding like large amounts of synthetic fertilizer. That is likely to have a much higher carbon emission than you even bringing green waste on and composting and things like that. So it's all relative, and that's not a get out of jail free card. That's actually, let's keep it in perspective. We're trying to grow food here. There is going to be some emissions, but just getting your numbers on how many you're producing doesn't mean you're doing a bad job.
That's lovely. Thank you both. And Martin, there's been a request for if there's a mailing list around that. And I think, we'd just be really interested in any kind of findings that come out of that. We've obviously got the composting in the community network sitting within Social Farms and Gardens. So any resources that come through, we'd love to host them on our website.
Yeah, so please get in contact with the Compost and the Community Network, which I'm part of. Lizzy, have we got a mailing list that we can help? You can add people to for your side.
Yeah, so we have Farm Carbon Toolkit newsletter that goes out every month. When you join it, when you sign up for the Farm Carbon Calculator, it'll ask you if you want to sign up. So that's probably the easiest way, rather than us spamming you all.
Lovely, thank you. Vicky, you had your hand up, but it's gone down. Are you there with a question?
Oh, I think it's okay. I was just saying that when we were doing this sort of thing, it was really planning ahead, which was the biggest part of it. That was really valuable. And then when you were talking about the compost emissions, I mean, you need to feed the soil. So if the alternative is artificials, do you not have some way to look at the savings of using compost, if there is any, against artificials? So those are the only two questions.
We don't so when you swap out artificial fertilizer for compost, it's not a direct swap. You're not using the same amount, so it's quite hard to make those comparisons without real case studies, and that's what we'd like to develop more of, but it needs that research underlying it to say that's how much fertilizer you would swap out. But what you can do is, if you know the nitrogen content of your compost, you can take that and work out the equivalent in like an ammonium nitrate or a urea, or even a composted cow manure, for example. All of those options are on the site, and you can literally compare them in the tool. You don't have to finish that report. It can just be for testing. It can just be for your own comparisons. But obviously all of the information's there and available, so you can use it for your own kind of what if scenarios. What if I were to replace 1 kilo of nitrogen from synthetic fertilizer with 20 tons of compost? And you probably find that actually that's not an unrealistic comparison in the end. But equally, we work with farmers across the board, and there is no one size fits all way of producing the same product, the same food. It depends where you are and what soils you're working with in the first place. But equally, there are a series, I'll put a link in the chat in a minute, of the standard food emissions factors that catering, hospitality and retail use if they don't have the carbon footprint from the grower they buy from. And those are based on like very generic averages. So if you do your footprint and you can work out your own emissions per kilo of broccoli, or whatever it is, you can check against that database to see whether it's higher or lower. But again, don't be put off if it is higher, because you might be offering a lot of other benefits that a larger grower might not be able to offer, such as access to nature, social growing. You might be able to like guarantee organic, for example, have a shorter supply chain. So again, I always say to people, don't get too hung up on the numbers. The best person to compare against is yourself last year. So if you start now, you'll have something to compare against next year to see if you're improving and whether any of your changes that you might implement have actually made it.
Sorry, when we included our transport to the site in our emissions, and because that was actually the key emission that there was, and we then calculated we'd have to produce quite a lot of food to offset that. But if we were producing not, then it would be a really beneficial thing, because we were looking at fossil fuel, more like a sort of scope 3 kind of thing.
Yes, yeah. So there's, again, like Vicky's hit on, there's different boundaries you can draw in terms of, you can imagine if you wanted to, you could go back to the nth degree. So you could say, well, we bought some straw from this person and they produced this, and then they bought some fertilizer from this person. You could keep going and going back, but there's
the money,
quite a clear boundary to draw, and the site will guide you through it.
I'm conscious of time, but we've just got a couple of questions that I wonder whether people might like to say out loud. So it's Shiri and then Shannon. Shiri, you've asked a question about flowers and grass, and I wonder whether that might have been answered just then in Lizzy's thing. But did you want to say anything? Are you there? No, it's not looking like it's coming off mute at the moment. So it's just a question about kind of an off-the-shelf calculation for flowers versus grass, but I presume that could be done using the you know, just using the tool, putting in the different amounts and
so it is. I've read Sherry's question. It's actually really difficult because so in international carbon accounting guidelines, grassland is considered so anything that is basically unfertilized, semi-natural or natural grassland, and it's considered to be a kind of net zero. So it's considered that the amount that it sequesters is offset by the amount it releases as it dies and turns over. There's plenty of scientific evidence to say that's not true in, say, a wildflower meadow, but that's the accepted rule, essentially. So even for a lot of farmers, they're not getting any sequestration benefit off the shelf for the grassland that they manage. And the same would be true for installing wildflower turf or seeding flower meadows, for example. But what you can do to evidence any soil carbon benefit of your practices is to take deep soil carbon samples. So you need at least multiple years of this sampling to be able to evidence any change, because obviously it's a change, so you can't do it from one set of samples. And we have, again, I'll share a link, we have a protocol that makes this easy to do yourself. It does incur a cost to have soil sampling done. We see it as an investment in having that information into the future. But no, there's no off-the-shelf sequestration value for grass or for wildflowers or flowers in general.
Shannon, did you want to just raise your question about deep mulching? Oh, sorry, Sherry, I've just seen. Yeah, I can read your question. No, sorry. Yes, just a question about a deep wood mulch with wood chip, and I assume we're kind of instead of composting, or just what the impact of that would be. Would that give off quite a lot of carbon?
So it will slowly release most likely some nitrous oxide as it decomposes, but it's much slower to break down. It's unlikely to release a lot of emissions in the year that you apply it. And it does so in a much slower, more controlled way than adding something that's higher in nitrogen. So what we'd recommend is, in the tool, there's an option under materials for adding wood chip that you use as mulch. It will have an embedded emission of you bringing it in, and obviously because it's quite a bulky and heavy product, that can add up quickly. There's just a one size fits all wood chip for mulching emissions factor. It might be that you can source it really locally, and that would be a much lower source of emissions. But obviously you can imagine in this sort of space, there's a lot of averages going into this. And again, this is something that people can get worried about. It's like, oh, it's too average. Everything has to be a starting point in carbon footprinting. So start with an estimate and then make the estimate better by getting better data. So you will see after a couple of years of using the tool how quickly the information improves. So I've been working on the tool for 3 years, and compared to when I started, we already have better information on literally everything we've talked about in this conversation through those annual update processes. So it's really worth kind of getting a baseline sorted, adding whatever you can, and just making a note. So there's sections throughout the tool to make notes. If there's something you can't find, if there's something that you think, well, I think that's important, but I can't find it here, or I can't work out how to add it, just keep a note, because chances are next year when you come back, that thing might be there to start including and thinking about, and you can start kind of building your own understanding of where the most important contributions are in your footprint.
Brilliant. I think that sounds like a good note to finish on. Thanks so much, Lizzie. We will be sharing the recording, which I will stop doing now, and we will be sharing some of those